So, now that we've got the cassette on and everything, now here's an example of something that can get screwed up. You're not going to be able to see it. My camera's not good enough, so I'm not even going to try. But what I did is when I put the new lock ring on, there's a little bit of dust in there, and so the lock ring is actually somewhat uneven. I also don't know whether or not I've put enough force on or too much force because I don't have a torque wrench. So those are examples of things that amateurs like yours truly tend to screw up that you don't really know. So you really want experience with this on lower end bikes. That's why I'm doing this with an 8-speed and not my 10-speed or 11-speed, super bike or whatever. Okay, you wanna do this with cheaper bikes. If something goes wrong with this is only like a $30 or so, or maybe a little less, cassette. And the bearings and stuff on my back wheel are not the best either, so I'm not too worried about messing that stuff up. So anyways, now this is a big thing that I see a lot of people screw up when they put chains back on. Okay, so when you put your chain back on, the derailleur, okay, you have to make sure that when you go over the first sprocket, which is the one in here, it has to go over, it has to go like this. It has to go over this little, it's hard for me to see it through the camera's lens, but it has to go over this like that. Okay, it can't come over this way. It has to go through in between that part and that chain. This way it doesn't rub on it. And then when it comes up, gotta get some meat in there. When it comes up, it goes over the next one. And let me see if I can show you this. This is critical. I see this messed up all the time. When you pull it up through, okay, you have to make sure it doesn't do that. It has to go through this little guy. It's got to go underneath. Got to go underneath this piece, onto the second, onto this part. Okay, that's how it's got to go. So we're going under the first thing, making sure we don't put it on this guy back in here. Okay, we make sure it doesn't do that. And then when we bring it up, we have to make sure it comes back up and over the second one and through this little metal piece, okay? And that's how to put it through the rear derailleur. Oh, and I got it on this wrong cogs here, so let me make sure I put it on the correct, which is the smallest, and this, actually I'm just gonna adjust the derailleur. Okay. And I'll just put the derailleur down a gear so that it makes sense with the one that I'm in. Okay. Now the new chain is going to come with its own oil on there, but we actually want to put fresh oil on there, on the chain, because the oil it comes with is just for to retard the decaying process. So we really want to put some new chain lube on there before our first ride. Otherwise your first ride is going to devastate the chain, because the oil it comes with is going to absorb a bunch of dust from the air, and it's going to absolutely destroy the chain. So we put new chain oil. In fact, we almost cleaned the old stuff off with some degreaser, okay? It's very sticky, its viscosity is very different from chain lube. Same thing with the cassette, okay? The cassette comes with some oil on there to prevent rusting and whatnot. Anyways, so that's how you replace your chain in your cassette, which you should go through about 3 chains per cassette. So about 3 chains per cassette and about 2 or 3 cassettes per chain rings. Your chain rings are much simpler to replace than the cassette. Your chain rings just come off of chain ring bolts. Now, finding the correct replacement parts is for another time, because that's a very complicated, it's simple in some ways, but it's more complicated than a lot of people tend to think. when you find the right parts, the correct gear ratios and everything, take a long time to actually figure out what you really need, depending on your, your level of, I don't want to call it intelligence, but your level of knowledge about bicycles. So, and even if you know a lot, you still need to take your time finding the right gear ratios and everything. Anyways, the other thing is your chain rings have a bolt circle, which is why sometimes it's called the crank set instead of the chain set. The two chain rings are part of a crank set because it really matters what crank you have, because the right crank arm has a bolt circle on it, and that cannot be changed. So when you get new chain rings, if it has 50 teeth, that's not the only thing that matters. It also has to have the right bolt circle, which is the spacing between these bolts. Okay, so if we're going to have spacing between these bolts, it has to be the exact same spacing in order for your new chain rings to work at all. The other thing is chain rings have different thicknesses for different speeds. So you do have 8-speed chain rings and 11-speed chain rings. Even though the chain rings are not, even though I only have 2 chain rings, they have a certain thickness which corresponds with the chain, which corresponds with the thickness of the rear cogs of the the rear gears, which are called cogs. So all that's critical to have right when you're replacing stuff on your drivetrain, which is, other than tires, the most common maintenance on a bicycle because it runs out the fastest. The second most common is going to be, other than tires and inner tubes, which really depends on the tires and inner tubes you have, is going to be brake pads. Brake pads need replacing every 2,000 or 3,000 miles. Then after that, in my opinion, you should just replace the bike, okay? Because bearings in the wheels and stuff should last between 7,000 and 20,000 miles. Bearings in the crankset should last about the same amount of time. Bearings in the headset last 10,000 miles. Everything else lasts about 10,000 miles. Your seat, your handlebars and whatnot. The seat breaks down. It really depends on the seat, but seats break down over 10,000 miles. Okay, the frame itself, usually you wind up crashing at some point within around 10,000 to 20,000 miles. So in my opinion, every 10 to 20,000 miles you should just replace your bike, because it's going to be almost just as cheap. But that's just an opinion. I mean, you can keep going with the same bike forever if you really want to. Anyways, but after about 10 to 20,000 miles, which is 1 to 5 years, anywhere from 1 year to 5 years, unless you're really elite. I really have my doubts that you're doing more than 20,000 in a year, but if you're really elite, then maybe within 1 year, but usually you have 1 to 5 years, and at that point your bike's going to be somewhat dated. And for most people, we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years by the time they've put that many miles on. And that's going to be dated enough to say, well, maybe my frame is out, has older technology, I might as well get a new bike. So, to me, the brakes, the drivetrain and component systems, the accessories on the bike, maybe the seat, if the seat wears down fast, the handlebar tape, okay, and the tires are the things that I tend to replace without replacing the whole bike. Anyways, that's all. Okay, just some information and some opinions.